much for that fulsome introduction. You know, rock star, I won't sing. But I'm really happy to be here. And therefore, I must first of all thank those of you who are involved in bringing me here. So that's everybody at the Children's Rights Alliance and all the supporting organizations, the Catherine Howard Foundation, and now I always forget, of course, the third one you forget, do you know that? And the Children's Foundation Ireland, for bringing me here. In 1989, the UK ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And that was the year that I started work at Save the Children. And since then, I've always really enjoyed being in the company of people who take children's rights very seriously. So you can imagine this is a particular pleasure for me to be here today. I've called my presentation Reflections because I do want to take you along on a journey of standing back a little bit, looking back a bit before looking at the future. So I want to look a little bit at the history with you, the evolution of early childhood education and care, and I'm using those terms advisedly, before I then look at that issue of marketized childcare, the systems which have different partners, and I'll come back to that, and the impacts on children growing up with disadvantage, and on children in poverty, really. And then I'll explore with you, again, I will go across borders, some of the resistance to marketization and privatization in different countries, before looking at the how of resisting what has been done in various countries. Okay, what can you do if there is a dynamic that actually excludes children in poverty? Because that's very much a key point about that. And then I'll reflect on what I've just said, you know, and hopefully we can all discuss it next. So we'll start with evolution, or call it history. Because when you look back, there are some wonderful books about this. When you look back, you can see that early childhood education has quite a long history. It has a long history in Europe and the USA, as a very good book by Willikens et al. Tells you, with lots of contributions. But I wanted you to also know, of course, and remind ourselves that it also emerges in the 19th century in India and China. What we're doing really here is sharing experiences and being aware that the issues that Ireland faces are issues that are being shared globally. There's everywhere, not just in terms of early childhood education, but also in that field of childcare. I will be using that term. I hope it doesn't cause too many objections. I know that your program for government uses the term childcare, so maybe I'm allowed to. And of course, the support, certainly public support, develops very slowly. First is philanthropic support, it's churches, if you look at the history of early education. And then, in the case of childcare, you see that there is public support, state money goes into it. And we see in the course of the 20th century particularly, and we see then, as Bonoli has described very well for Europe, that state support that comes on stream for childcare for the children of working parents is very much related to Labour Party market policies. It's also happening in Asia. Think of Korea, think of Japan, China, Singapore. And what is important to remember is that when this is happening, we're already in a period of what we call welfare state retrenchments, when the funding of other public services is being reduced or withdrawn. So that, surprisingly, when we complain about not enough money in the system, actually, in a lot of countries, this form of provision is still getting a lot more public money invested in it than other parts of public services. So that's probably worth remembering, and I'll come back to that when I use the case study of England. And then in the 21st century, it becomes very obvious that there is much more support going into childcare for children of working parents in OECD member states, and more support still largely from supranational organizations and so on for childcare in low and middle income countries. So I'd like to describe these dynamics a little bit as evolution at a more steady pace in the case of those early childhood education, very often a service that does not allow parents to go out to work during those hours their children receive what is developmentally a very important service, no doubt, if it's good quality, but more of a revolution for childcare. It's in a shorter time scale. Sometimes it's quite dramatic what happens. And then what we see happening is, of course, that what happened before there was that public interest in that service is that the market fills the gaps. When there is no public funding, and historically, of course, for a very long time there wasn't any, then people get by organizing for themselves, and you get markets. And then you get the welfare state, post-Second World War, not everywhere, of course, when you look globally, and you see that when there is that welfare state retrenchment, even though governments may still go on spending public money on the system, they may stand back and allow private providers to deliver those services with public money and with parents' own money. And you see that is privatization, and we need definitions, don't we? Well, I think we need definitions. And then we have marketization, the introduction of funding models that encourage consumer choice, bring the market into that area, and also may bring a competitive element into what is essentially a public system. And the example I shall give is of Finland, which you all think of as a public system, but actually there's a very strong marketization dynamic ever since one of the more center-right and center-left governments introduced a voucher system. You get a voucher system, you get vouchers to buy your own provision for your children, you will have marketization. Now, my third bullet point says marketization is often used as a shorthand for both things, and that's how I will use it. Okay? But if I confuse you, stop me and make me clarify. So, we end up today with different types of marketized and privatized systems. They're not all the same, and you probably know all this, but I think we should remind ourselves of how different they can be. Let's look at England and Ireland. We have a mixed market for children up to school age, where we have public provision, we have private for-profit and private not-for-profit provision, right? So we have public provision in nursery classes in primary schools, that is nursery term time only, part-time, I'll come back to the details, and then in charitable organizations, charitable social enterprise like Acorn Childcare that I was a trustee of for 7 years, stood down as chair last summer. And then we have private for-profit provision. So that's one. Now in Ireland, unless I'm gravely mistaken, you have had a market which is just private for-profit or not-for-profit provision and childminders. Childminders in the English system are more integrated and have been for a longer time, but there is an important project going on here, isn't there, to integrate childminders into the system, and so parents using them will also qualify for public money to pay for part of those services. So, and then you have the opposite in Germany, where you have a marketized system which is a not-for-profit market, where the traditional delivery partners for these services, a very strong role for the churches there, Catholic in the south, Protestant in the north, has kept for-profit provision out quite successfully. In Germany, there is no public subsidy for a private for-profit chain. About 3% of provision in Germany is private for-profit. That means the parents pay for everything, right? And it's also a country which has a legal right to a place for every child from the age of 1 year. We come back to that as well. I've already mentioned Finland. Every Nordic country is challenged by marketization. So we shouldn't have a sort of idea that this is a pure system in the different countries. They're all coping with those dynamics in different ways. But there is very strong pressure, and we know that the key result is that systems become more socially segregated and that poor children are the first to miss out. And then, before we go on to the next slide, remember that there are countries like the Netherlands and France where services for children under 3 are marketized, but from 3 they go to nursery school, école maternelle, and then it's public. So you have this array of markets. They're not all the same. Ultimately, many of the issues that they face are similar. And the Netherlands also has children going at 4 into nursery classes for 2 years that are part of primary schools. It's the extended school where they go. What we've seen as a result of this growth of public money is that whole market dynamic has really grown. As soon as there is a step change in the amount of public money that comes into these services, we see the markets change, and we see for-profits coming in and really trying to maximize their profits. And we see consolidation, that is certain groups, and I'm talking about group-based provision now, I'm not talking about childminders, creating ever larger groups. And we get large international groups. Now, you know some of them here too. So, Prentice and White, colleagues of mine in Canada, who've done some excellent work charting that and showing how it happens and the risks associated. We've already mentioned the major risk: social segregation, no more community provision. We all go to different things depending on how much our parents are able to contribute. So this has been attacked by various academics. Professor Marmot already mentioned neoliberalism. You are maybe familiar with Peter Moss's work, University College London. He's written a big book about the risks, the dangers of this commodification, as if children are, mobile phones or whatever, the same sort of commodification. And then another book that I recommend if you ever wanted to do some research on this or where you're writing something is by Michel van den Broek, Belgian researcher, and colleagues Lera and Linda Mitchell from New Zealand, which is about what happens on the ground in terms of on-the-ground resistance to commodification, by educated researchers and providers, and that they have examples throughout the world. Because, as I said at the beginning, this is by now a global phenomenon. We see everywhere, also in sub-Saharan Africa, and very much in Latin America, and very much in Asia, already mentioned Asia, we see that there is real interest in state governments supporting this form of provision, both early education and childcare. But by and large, when it's services for under 3s, they still get far less support than what the OECD calls pre-primary education. Now, if you'd like my slides afterwards, you can write to me and I'll send them to you with all the links. Okay, but I have just included just a couple of slides from an essential companion to your research on marketized childcare system, which is from the European agency, Eurydice, an arm's length agency, which collects all the data on EU countries and their systems and what happens. And this happens to show you the significance of the private sector. I'm going to turn around just to see how well you can see this slide. I'm not going to talk to the slide, okay? Tell me to turn back to you. I think that's probably okay, isn't it? But the darkest color is significance. 30% or more of the places are private. And you could ask for a lot more detail. Of course, you could say, okay, private, for-profit, not-for-profit. But take it from me, most of it would be for-profit. And then you've got a paler blue, which is medium, 10 to 30%. And the very pale blue is fewer than 10% of the places are for profit. Now, if you look at France, because we can't recognize all of these countries, can we? Well, I can't, but I've tried, of course. I'll be looking them up. But France would have all that public provision for children aged 3 and over. Actually, they're often not yet 3 when they join the école maternelle. So that's what accounts for that. So you really need to know a little bit about the system. That's why I was telling you, or reminding you, before you can interpret these data properly. So, and then, importantly, you can see that the Nordic countries and Germany have at least 50% of centre-based childcare, publicly funded. So, and they have income-related fees, but you do recognise all sorts of things that you've got in Ireland. Don't knock it. And sometimes we just don't have data, because the government is not into collecting the kind of data that the European Commission strongly recommends they do collect. Anyway, this is sort of where you can unpack what's happening. And then we see the UK, and there's nothing there because we had Brexit. And so this valuable data that we've built up over the years, it has stopped. Okay, and so I was talking about increasing marketization with increasing numbers of for-profit providers delivering services, early childhood education and care as sort of integrated in England. And then there is a further development. I think it goes back to the 80s in the USA, but it's a bit later in Europe and in England. That is, we get particular types of firms, venture capital companies, private equity firms, hedge funds, that come in and lend money to groups of providers. And they are known as the non-banking financial institutions, non-banking financial companies, or the shadow banking sector. And they are far less tightly regulated than banks that give you loans, far less. And what they do, though, is lending the money against very high interest payments. We also have, the sale of shares in early childhood companies, early childhood childcare companies that have that. So there is a big pressure on those providers and the groups to make a profit. And so again, anything to make a profit certainly would be a risk to including children who might need additional support. That might cost money, that might cost manpower. But what is also very much present here is financialization, and that is really that those very large companies are financially very unstable because they are so heavily leveraged, technical terms, they are so heavily indebted to their investors. And that's a big risk. So as you get that dynamic in a country, we very much have it in England, you're actually undermining the stability of your early years provision, because in the meantime, while very heavily indebted, they're still hoovering up small providers and everything. And if they hoover them up, sometimes that means closing them down, eliminate the competition, or sometimes it just means making them part of the bigger group. The risks are now quite well recognized even in other sectors of the economy. I wouldn't say that I have a strong view on private sector investment in other parts of the economy. But certainly the Bank of England has been stress testing the economy in terms of what the shadow banking sector is doing, to what extent they're actually responsible for the operation of various sectors. And the EU is now planning stress testing because they're pretty worried about massive collapses and what that would do to the economy. So let's look at impact on... I'm probably going... Okay. I'm okay for now. Impact. Okay, let's very quickly go through impact on children growing up with disadvantage. There is a lot of research. By and large, a systematic review of relevant research by Brogard and Helby Peterson says that lower service quality, that may surprise you, you know, if parents pay very high fees in these places compared to not-for-profit and public provision. And crucial to the quality of provision is that workforce pay, practitioner pay, educator pay, whatever you want to call it, is lower in those big chains than it is in not-for-profits. And of course, very different, certainly in England, compared to the public sector where it's all regulated. The Netherlands can demonstrate higher staff turnover, and there is an uneven distribution of settings. A very good study by Peter Hurley from Australia, Melbourne, of 9 countries, including the 4 countries making up the UK, about the fact that in disadvantaged areas where there isn't a lot of profit to be made by asking parents to pay higher and higher fees, then you see childcare deserts. I'm sure you've used the term here as well. I was involved in a study that UCL carried out, or a team at UCL, which looked at those dynamics in England. And some of our contributors were forensic accountants. And if you haven't come across forensic accountants, I think you should. I've become very fond of them, but they're all about where does the money come from and where does it go. And you need them when you're looking at this area, you really do. So we found out a lot of things about what was happening in England over the last 20 years. That was between the beginning of the century and 22. And one of the striking characteristics was that, yes, 70% of all English group-based provision is in the private for-profit sector. That's most. And there is that acquisitions and mergers and debt to often international private equity investors. That is pretty much characteristic of the sector. The financialization that I already mentioned. You can't find those big corporate childcare change another term in disadvantaged areas because there's no money to be made. Staff costs. And what was particularly striking, that in those 20 years there wasn't an increase in places. There was consolidation, hoovering up, but that didn't mean that these places got bigger in terms of places because they often closed them down. You know, only location, location, location is the term. You go to well-to-do residential areas, and that's where you have your settings. And parental fees were very high. And we see that since we did that study, which was published in 22, the Guardian newspaper got money from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, a charitable foundation, to do a study of all the nurseries in England and to look at the extent of private equity involvement in them. We didn't have money from the Nuffield Foundation, very grateful for the money, but we didn't have money to look at everything because the forensic accountancy process is quite detailed and takes time and effort, right? So, and they looked at 4 years only, 18 to 22, basically, and saw and found very worrying things. And my third bullet point in the left-hand column is the one that I want to draw your attention to, because it is about the loss of private not-for-profit groups, how they have not been able to cope. Either they're hoovered up or they have just been unable to make enough money to keep going. And that's a third of non-profit in disadvantaged areas. And remember what non-profits and public provision has in common, that they have much more often provision for children growing up with various forms of disadvantage. And they are in poor areas of poverty. So What have been the emerging policy responses to this? What have countries done which have been struggling with these dynamics when governments have realized that quite a lot of public funding goes into paying debts, paying interest to private equity companies or paying out this money as dividends to shareholders? Well, resistance in Denmark has been quite extreme over time. Denmark was going down the same black hole as everybody else with growing privatization. Remember, the Nordic countries are not what we sometimes think they are. It's much more complex than that. And eventually, in 2020, there was introduction of very stringent regulatory standards. The Nordic countries always rely on regulation, and they hope regulation will be sufficient to ensure that public money goes to achieve the outcomes that the government intends with its policies and strategies. And Denmark has a legal right to a place too. Only one of 6 EU countries with a legal right for the youngest children, not just older children. More often a legal right for children aged 3 to 6, but not so much from 0 to 3. So since 2004, Canada, some of you will be familiar with the exciting developments within Canada, where the federal government is aiming for a $10 a day parental fee for any parent with their children in early education and care. Again, mostly they do have kindergarten, so it's for the younger children. Lots of money being thrown at it. So there's been a phased process, halving parental fees, and then this year it should come in at $10 a day. But of course, Canada, like Germany, is a federal state, and that throws up a whole range of different challenges about the degree of autonomy that each state has in what it will implement and what it won't do. And at the moment, that's my final bullet point, a very, very accomplished and relevant economist and journalist, Armin Yalnizyan, has pointed out through her forensic accountancy analysis that almost half the net sector growth of the last few years has been amongst for-profits, whereas there is that explicit aim of promoting not-for-profits and public provision. So it's harder than you think. The Netherlands decided to start paying 96% of all costs from 2025. It announced this in 2022. I think it only took until April of that year for the government to say, no, we're postponing this. We haven't got the money. So it's going to be 2027. And there was real concern amongst stakeholders that this would boost the presence of private equity investors in the market. Because it's a market for under fours. So there are several references here to work on that. That is my evidence that I need to present to you. It is not something that I've made up. But they took a considered decision, the government, to commission 2 reports to map what was going on and to then look at how they might develop regulatory measures to counter and address what was going on. They're good reports, interesting, but the growth of private equity in the Dutch early education and care market continues apace, as my last. Now, this is the sort of thing they found, the reports about the differences between private equity supported provision and that which has escaped the clutches, if I may say so, of private equity. And so there are a lot of things, and one of the things is my penultimate point, is that private equity investors tend to pull out after a few years when they think they've maximized what they can do in terms of getting profit out of a company, a corporation. They will pull out and they will realize their profits and somebody else will have to be found. There was also a very massive collapse more than 10 years ago in the Netherlands. The main provider collapsed. when the amount of leverage they could get was massive, massive. It's only been allowed since the 90s when they changed the international accountancy rules. Did you know that? So actually your whole balance sheet changed and what you had to say and what you didn't have to say. So there have been international measures which have meant that basically you can be much more indebted than would once have been found acceptable. So again, that fragile system. So I'm coming here with my slide from the wonderful 2025 Eurydice report, Key Data on Early Childhood Education and Care in Europe. And just to give you an idea about when different countries in Europe provide a guarantee, if they do, to a place. And again, you will see that a few countries stand out. So if you're wondering about the countries on the margin, it is Latvia and Estonia and Slovenia who guarantee that from a very early age. And most of them still do that for what OECD insists on calling, with some justification, pre-primary education. So what now about the how of reducing the risks? I think the risks are okay now to you, they're clear to you. Again, all this keeps poor children out because providers need to target parents who can pay for additional hours not funded by government, additional hours of childcare. And so how do you draw up guardrails against private equity investment? Well, there are non-legal measures and there are binding measures. And if you're going to have binding measures like a price cap, I mean, Ireland, look at yourselves and be proud. But I am not an unbiased observer of this situation. Dividend standard, i.e. you can only pay so much out in dividend solvency requirements. You mustn't be as highly leveraged beyond a certain point. It's all been looked at. Very good study from the University of California at Berkeley, which has had a very active team working on resisting the penetration by private equity of the American childcare market, which is high. I mean, at least 10% of the big groups are private equity supported, so very financially fragile and unstable. And a major writer on this is Elliot Haspel, an American working for the think tank Capita, who has been looking at that as well. And England comes under resistance as well, because what has England been doing? England, since the Labour government came to office, has been promoting public provision. In fact, the first year of the Labour government, those of us who were involved with private for-profit or not-for-profit chains didn't get a look in because all the official announcements were about school-based nurseries and everything to do with how they were going to do that. I'm very quickly showing you here the type of subsidies. Basically, in the English market, the private sector could also deliver the funded hours, absolutely. Like here, like in Ireland, you recognize it. And since 2017, those funded hours were actually 30 for children with employed parents. Certain employment criteria apply. And then, just the last bullet point in the right-hand column, what has been happening is that the amount of public funding that has gone into these subsidies has outstripped massively any other funding that has gone into the widest children's services, for instance, children's centres, or indeed support for parents through the benefits system. It will be next year about 16 times more proportionately. So there is a lack of balance that has crept in. The Institute for Fiscal Studies is the place where a lot of very good research on this has been done. And we have to remind ourselves that while this promotion of school-based nurseries is going on, 2/3 of children who qualify for any publicly funded provision are found in the private sector. Right, so there is an imbalance there. got to keep that in. And the Labour government inherited a poisoned chalice from the preceding government. And here, Professor Mahmoud would say, I'm not party political, but, and I have to say that too. But they promised 30 hours for all children in working families from the age of 9 months until they went to compulsory schooling. That is a massive commitment, very expensive. And I'm not sure that the previous government thought they would ever have to deliver it. But the Labour government felt they could not create losers, so they had to commit to it. And that's what we're coping with at the moment. September 2025 came and went. And yes, the offer is there. The reality is different because we have a massive workforce crisis, recruitment and retention crisis. I think you've got a bit of a crisis in Ireland here as well. Right. Because we haven't done anything about regulating employment rights and introducing a workforce strategy. That's all still to come. So what is happening that, we've got this promise of new places in schools, and they are very different from new places in the private sector, as you know, because they're term time only, and it's very unclear what schools will actually be able to do. Schools have always been different, and nursery classes have a completely different ratio, 1 teacher and possibly an assistant to 30 children. You know, very different from what happens in the day nurseries in the private sector. So there is a real risk now to the delivery of those 15 hours that we have, the universal offer. Now, there was a slide earlier, do I need to go back, which said we have 15 hours for all children who are aged 3 and 4, 15 hours of free early education, I'll call it that, for children, 2-year-old children who are growing up with disadvantage. Their numbers have dropped dramatically for reasons I won't go into. And then we have 30 hours for those children in working families. Now, there is a real risk to the delivery of those 15 hours for the children growing up with disadvantage, be it low-income families, be it children with SEND, as we call it, special educational needs and/or disabilities, children with English as a second language who need to catch up. And that risk is because it is now not just the private sector which wants to deliver the 30 hours as long as, fingers crossed, the money is sufficient. The money is more, but it's also schools that are under that pressure to deliver 30 hours rather than 15 hours, which is a pretty extreme situation. If you think of education, publicly funded education, and you think, hang on, our education is now determined by parental income, parental employment status. What's going on here? Where's the principles? Where's the ethics? And then, as I already mentioned, we've got a huge workforce recruitment and retention crisis. So the problem is not finding staff. And the problem is we're not getting a very good insight into what is actually happening on the ground. In September, the first round of 300 school-based nurseries started work. What do they do? Do they have 2-year-olds? Are they completely new? It takes a lot of digging before you find out what is actually happening there. And there were some pretty heavy warnings about this way of going about things from a House of Commons Education Committee report after an inquiry, and very importantly, from the National Audit Office. They have got my accountants, again, very fond of the National Audit Office, full of accountants, very good work. They said, but it didn't mince its words in its report, a regressive policy neglecting the childcare needs of disadvantaged children. And the other thing is that the Institute of Fiscal Studies comes in left field saying, well, actually, the government didn't forecast the enthusiasm from working parents for this offer. So they have miscalculated the expense, the cost of this, by about £1 billion. What we also see locally is that schools may get rid of established partnership. In the case of the group, the not-for-profit group I'm now a patron of, which is very nice. You know, we got such an offer after 28 years of working happily together. Like, could you now just vacate the premises because we are going to do something? And that is happening. But you have to remember that there are only, you know, very few schools were actually working in partnership with the private sector to deliver whole-day provision or anything like that. Mostly schools were just delivering part-time provision during term time. But it is clear that the government hasn't got itself ready to intervene when that's happening. Local government is lacking relevant powers. So I've come to my reflections. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay, we're finishing up. So what have we learned from what I've given you? Maybe you've learned nothing, and I think it's all crystal clear, but let's try. Expanding publicly delivered provision in response to advanced marketization is rare. England has tried to do it. Singapore is one of the places that has done it. That's interesting. Making lasting improvements to private sector workforce paying conditions, infrequently done. Unless you have a legal right and you're a Nordic country and so on, and unless you're Ireland. Just, you know, think about it. Consider what's been happening here carefully. And then I've already mentioned that if you're in a federal nation, you're going to face extra hurdles. If you want, like in Germany, get much more unification and harmonization of quality and the regulation of quality. A real struggle. Canada, I already said, actually, they want a private not-for-profit provision, but they're not getting it. So enforcement of conditions to qualify for public funding is rare, again, except in the highly regulated northern systems, Germany and Ireland. And then the next point is just there to please me, because I know that Norway was struggling with very strong campaigning by the private sector when they wanted to make sure that public funding was not used for debt repayments or shareholder dividends. And they were having real problems implementing a piece of legislation that would do just that. So when I wrote a little piece in the brochure that accompanies the Starting Strong Aid report published by OECD in January 25, so when I did that, I could only write about Norway being in a struggle about implementing legislation which the private for-profit sector found unfair. But they won, so I'm very pleased. They have now got that legal prohibition on public funding going into debt replay. So, and then recent research I've been doing in Korea, not in Korea, with Korean colleagues and now with Japanese colleagues about similar issues in Asia, you know, in the very industrialized countries where, and looking at the other factors that are impacting. In Korea, for instance, there is so much money going into the early years system, you wouldn't believe it. But the impact of that money is not the same as it is in England, actually, in terms of women's employment rates, for instance, because there are many other factors that militate against this being a success. I had to finish with proportionate universalism. I think that introducing a legal right also would force a system, like Ireland's system, my personal view, to address all the issues about making the services accessible for children growing up in poverty and eliminating any factors that make fees high and so on. We've already done so much of this groundwork, just sort of capital. But it goes together, certainly in England, with the need to give adequate legal authority to local or regional government. That role is crucially important. Or if we have an agency like Ireland, then it's got to be able to intervene in the processes, intervene in the dynamics that are going on the ground. So collaboration, of course. with civil society organizations and stakeholder groups to realize the shared vision. I think that First 5 is a very good example of that. And finally, the warning that a rapid expansion really and policy change can pose a risk to quality, to inclusion, to all those things. So tread carefully. Good luck and thank you.
Thanks for exposing the underbelly of the marketisation of early childhood education and care. It's not often you hear an address that name checks the value of forensic accountants quite so often, but I guess even they must have their moment, and I can see in this field they've been essential to your research. So, you know, just thinking about your role in advising the Irish government and your reflections on the international context there, we have the research and the right policies. What do you think are the main roadblocks when it comes to implementation in the Irish context?
In a sense, it's difficult for me to say that now when so much still has to be specified, although there is quite a bit in the programme for government, quite a bit is explicit. One of the roadblocks could well be the resistance that Norway encountered in the implementation of particular measures that I just described. That could be the private sector. But then you've already had a couple of years to get used to that and deal with that. And Ireland has instituted a lot of regulatory measures and conditions that should help. So what is another risk is that the private sector loses interest. Okay, well, you do the bad bits of the country. There are no bad bits. You know what I mean, the poorer areas, and are very much, of course, the rural areas that are still, so where it is always much more difficult to offer services to everybody that are accessible to everybody. And I trust that the childminders in their new role will make a big difference there. So that's a risk. I do think there is still room for public-private partnerships and to make the most of public-private partnerships. I rather like the work of my UCL colleague, Professor Mariana Mazzucato, as an economist who has done a lot of work showing the value in public-private partnerships and really showing the value of the public side of public-private partnerships in terms of their ability to innovate and restructure. There has been often what she considers to be a rather pointless debate about, oh, the private sector is better at innovation, they're faster, they can do this, that, and the other. And she has, from the start, I'm thinking of a 2013 publication, attacked that and used very good case studies to show that the crucial role that a government can play in moving things on. And I think we've seen that in Ireland as well.
Okay, great. And before we go to the audience for a few questions, this might be a bit of a stupid question from me, but I'm going to go there. Just when you think about that, showing my age here, Pac-Man effect of the big providers on the little providers, why do countries not say, you know, regulate against big providers coming in and, you know, hoovering up the sort of modest-sized, community-based, positive providers?
Just saying it is not enough, and we have to distinguish, I think, and it's not a stupid question, of course. I wouldn't say that to my chair, would I? And, you know, distinguish between private for-profit and private equity-supported private for-profit, you know, which, in fact, my colleague, Antonia Simon at UCL, and a reference to her work, this year's work was up there, showed how, yes, in disadvantaged areas, the ones who are maintaining themselves are private for-profit, but not private equity-supported groups. They are not to be found in areas of disadvantage at all. They concentrate in the well-to-do areas. So it is very, very complex. And of course, it does relate to the amount of subsidy. For instance, in England now, subsidy for the children aged under 3 is really quite ample. And providers are not complaining about that now under the current government. But for 3 and 4-year-olds, it doesn't cover the costs. And again, Professor Marmot emphasized that this morning. In real terms, we have less money now than we had 10 years ago, 15 years ago. You have, we have in England. It is just such a difficult situation. So it is a matter of choices being made of where the money goes, yeah, and what is supported. And that's why England, I suppose, is choosing to say in its second funding round, which is a capital funding round, never enough on its own, never enough on its own. In its second round, it is telling applicants, local authorities, well, you must come with proposals for school-based nurseries in disadvantaged areas, because the first time round, it was pretty much a hodgepodge. And you thought, hang on, this government has an aim, and it's in the title of their new early years strategy, which is giving every child the best chance in life. You know, and this is not happening, so lots of things to resolve.
Okay, great. Do we have any questions? We take a couple and then go back to Professor Lloyd.
I've stunned them into silence.
Hello. Hello, Michelle Hart, the National Childhood Network. Thank you very much, Professor Lloyd. It was fantastic to hear you speaking and give us all that data, and for this morning as well, because it was great. It's been a great day in terms of thinking and reflection in relation to all the commonalities between both the keynotes and in terms of the panellists. But I suppose there's one question I don't think that we have asked ourselves nationally, and actually, what is the purpose of early childhood care and education? And this market has grown up around because it's been allowed to happen, and because people, for different reasons, began play groups in the early 60s, and and then we had a driver for economic through the OCP programme, and then with various policies after that. But we never really asked ourselves as a country, what is the actual purpose of early childhood care and education? And, from our perspective, we put children's rights at the heart of our organisation, and we think about children's education in that lens, from their perspective, and we know that they don't operate alone, that they are within a family, whether that's looked after or within their own family. So I just wondered, in terms of all the global things that you put out there, is that the question that people are asking themselves? And is that not the first question we should be asking?
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Michelle. And we'll take one more and then go back to Professor Lloyd. Yeah, thanks. And if you just say what your organisation is as well.
Hi, Elaine McQuillan from Start Bright Early Learning Centres. Just with all the studies done on other European or international countries against the not-for-profit community kind of services that largely use public funds, what's the risk appetite for those countries that are able to succeed? I know in the Irish context, the risk appetite for not-for-profits is probably not as low as it should be to succeed in that area. So I just wondered across other nations what that might look like.
Great, thanks, Elaine.
So I'm going back to the aims, the purposes, and the underlying values of early childhood education and care. And I think time and again, governments are reminded that they must be much more specific about that in consultation with stakeholders and parents and children and practitioners and providers about what the purpose is, and that this service is only an element within a much more comprehensive set of services supporting parents. So I haven't mentioned parental leave, maternity leave, paternity leave, and shorter working hours, family-friendly policies. And without those, you can't really talk about this, but I do, because at some stage you have to stop talking about everything. But these are crucially important. I do think that childcare and early education are indivisible in a sense, like the Nordic countries have tried to resolve that. And I think, like in Ireland, they did start with, from a gender perspective, equal opportunities for men and women in the workplace and no motherhood penalty for women in the workforce. And I think today, when you look around the world, and when I look at studies from Sub-Saharan Africa, Ethiopia, or South Africa, whatever, that is pretty much a global issue. It really is. It's not as if women have never worked before. They have always been working their socks off, but they've not been paid for it. Mm-hmm. And they have done different roles. I mean, I did another post. Yeah, I won't go there. I mustn't digress. So, yeah, this is very important to remind ourselves that we are trying to achieve both. Now, from time to time, you come up in a discussion against a pretty entrenched viewpoints that parents should be at home. And they say parents, they mean mothers, I'm afraid, looking after their children for quite an extended period of time. And I think that's, that choice is still there, except poverty prevents it in many cases. But it isn't quite reflective of the way we live now. So we must work on all these other services to value child rearing for what it's worth. And that isn't often made explicit, and it is not valued. But the value to society, the value to children's outcomes of parents having an unhurried approach, having space to parent, because that is often really at a premium, to do as much with their children, to be there as much for their children as they would like to be and as might be good for the whole family. So we just have to keep on trying to find that happy medium.
Great.
Now, the other question, appetite for risk. Am I right? Yes? Yep. I must ask you to specify it a bit more. Do you mean the appetite for risk by allowing highly leveraged big chains to operate, or what exactly? I may have forgotten. You may have said it. My apologies.
Just with funding and that, so obviously with childcare deserts, you know, not-for-profits, the sustainability of community services in Ireland, for example, you know, the services that they provide might sit outside the general early childhood education and care, so they might provide more parent supports, lower ratios for children that have additional needs. So there's lots more expenses on certain community services, which would be largely not-for-profit. We do get Equal Start funding, which helps with all of that, but, you know, there's never enough funding. So I guess with services that are closing down in disadvantaged community areas, the boards of management or the local councils, the risk for not-for-profits going in there is just a lot higher than the risk of a private provider that's for-profit coming in, and kind of that approach to taking over.
Yes, so that is another ethical question facing whoever is responsible in England. That will be local government, who would be, well, you'd like them to be responsible. In fact, they do not have the powers to determine entry and exit to the market in England. So that is their fulfilling their sufficiency duty is really hemmed in on every side. I think, obviously, the question that faces government then is support for the not-for-profits. That is, I have illustrated that with the case of Canada, and they haven't cracked it yet. You see, so, but what I have pointed out is that there is a risk attached to the for-profits as well in disadvantaged areas. You know, we have seen for-profits taking over from not-for-profits in English disadvantaged areas. We don't yet know where that will end. It might just end again with the desert. You know, and so to address that requires new strategies adapting to local conditions.
Okay.
Does that help?
Great. And we have time for a couple more questions. So over here.
Hello. That was most interesting, Professor Lloyd. Thank you very much for all your insights there. It struck me as you were speaking, first of all, my name is Regina Bushell. I'm the chair of SHASUS, which represents independent, for-profit, yes, providers, of which 75% of the services in Ireland are owned and operated. I started my service nearly 50 years ago. Shortly after I got married, and when my husband had to go guarantor for me for my first loan, for the first service that I started outside of my home. And the bank manager told me I would be better off doing something else, as women should be at home minding their children. But that's a long time ago. And it was just as the working ban was lifted here in Ireland. I suppose at the moment, to jump very much forward on, I have 6 services now with 140 people employed. And I can assure you, and everybody else here in this room, that it was women like me who started the childcare, I suppose, sector here in Ireland. We had no support from anybody. A lot of us got it from our husbands, or found other ways of making money. Our family, my family and friends supported me to develop my services. And I think that all of us know, the majority of people I deal with anyhow, the love of the child is first and foremost where they stand. And you mentioned other things like location when you were speaking earlier. And location is extremely important, because you won't see bigger services coming in trying to buy out smaller services. However, they're not being supported right now to stay open. What we are seeing is some of those equity groups looking to buy my services and other people's services around, and that is a real danger. It is a real threat, because we're under so much stress, staffing being one of them, funding being the other, that there is a danger that some of those services will actually sell out. And I would hate to see that happen. So I think some of what you're saying is really important. A public-private partnership needs to be the way forward, until maybe, for at least, until the government see where they're going in the future. And right now, there are a lot of very, very stressed and nervous providers in Ireland not knowing which way to go, especially when they may be getting offers to sell out. So I think we have to be extremely careful of that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Regina. So we'll take one more comment or question, and then we'll go back to Professor Lloyd. Yep.
Hello, thank you so much, Professor, for that. It was a really, really fascinating talk. So my name is Donal Swan. I'm from the National Women's Council of Ireland, and I suppose you've touched on some of the issues that I was going to ask about. Initially, I suppose just to recognise that how gendered this issue is, at a really broad level, but also how tied the sector is into so many other supports that impact families, that impacts women, and I suppose particularly as well that recognition that it's we very much often talk about this in the context of women's employment, and it's actually about women's contribution to society more generally, as you say, in terms of all of the work that women do, whether it be cultural, community, or broader and beyond that. And I suppose what you've outlined really, really well there at a broad level is how complex and different all of the different systems that we can possibly see and their interactions, right across Europe and beyond, and how, in terms of figuring out where we need to go from here, and we in the National Women's Council would really like to see us moving towards that more a public system, whatever that means down the line, but all of the different ways in which that can happen, but also how different pushback can come from different ways. I suppose just one question I wanted to ask you was in relation to, we've talked a good bit about disadvantage, but in relation to more specific marginalised groups that might not necessarily be totally place-based. I'm conscious of the likes of, in an Irish context, say the traveller community, which have particularly low levels of engagement in terms of the preschool ECHI scheme, but also the migrant communities and those children who are are in direct provision or whose parents are seeking international protection. And we've already talked earlier on about the impact for children and homelessness. I'd be very interested to hear what you think in terms of that planning issue of how we ensure an inclusive system for those children as well.
Great, thanks, Donal. So,
Right, well, thank you very much for that, sharing that history. And I can tell you that the group that I was involved with as a trustee was only 35 years old, but the bank manager's attitude was no different 35 years ago from what it was 50 years ago. And that is so contradictory, isn't it? Because we know that small businesses, they start small, set up by women, are much more likely to succeed than those set up by men. The statistics are there, so they always got it wrong. But
you're preaching to the converted here.
Right. So it is, you're right, there is a risk that is facing you, and it is facing providers in England, and I know how hard the struggle is, and it needs joint enterprise, it needs jointly addressing and being very, very clear about what will have the best results for children and families, but also for providers and for practitioners. That is key. But I do think that you are further along the road here in Ireland than we are in England in addressing those issues. Yeah. I'm sorry I can't give you more support, but lots of empathy and admiration. So the next question is about including the excluded groups in our population, because your early year services and policies should be for all children, and there is that issue of proportionate universalism that Professor Marmot talked about. Again, I think it cannot be an afterthought, and that's why I was, again, being biased, but so impressed with the fact that First Five really did look across those boundaries, and gradually you could see that attempts were made to think about things at the same time. You know, we had Partnership for the Public Good with recommendations for the funding model at the same time as a workforce strategy. At the same time, the sequencing of these things is so important to show everybody, providers and parents and children and practitioners and policymakers, that it is for all children. So yes, you have to address everything at once, but it also involves choices about resources. Very early on in the presentation, I did talk about the fact that actually this area has received so much more public funding across the world than other areas of public services. And ultimately, there will be politicians and so on who will say, well, hang on, what about the elderly? Hang on, what about the long-term sick? And so on. So you've got to be ready with your argument there for that. And by the way, I have to say when I talk globally, that by and large, while there is a real push for early education, public support for childcare, let's say, is still pretty much lacking in large parts of the world, but the governments simply haven't got the money or don't make it available for that. Yeah. Sorry, I hope it goes some way towards answering your question.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. All right, so please join me in thanking Professor Lloyd for a wonderful, thoughtful, thought-provoking presentation.